So in 1932, British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell penned an essay titled In Praise of Idleness. And now I've come to believe that the kind of concept that he gets at, or his thesis in this essay, is incredibly important for reshaping happiness in our society. So here's the TLDR. He says, I think that there is far too much work done in the world, that immense harm is caused by the belief that work is virtuous, and that what needs to be preached in modern industrial countries is quite different from what always has been preached. So the main idea of this kind of cultural criticism that he gets into is the idea that hard work, which we tend to like glorify and think like hard work is a virtue and you have to have this honest work, is in a lot of ways a form of manipulation, number one, and it's something that prevents us from sort of like maximizing or optimizing our happiness as a collective or as a society. So let's get into that. So he starts with a definition of both work and idleness, and I thought that was an interesting observation. He says, and I quote, work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relative to other matter. Second, telling other people to do so. So the first kind is unpleasant and often underpaid, and the second kind, the telling people what to move around, is often more pleasant and very highly paid. He also points out that there's like a third class of people. At that time, he called it the landowners. In our modern language, it's kind of like this class of people who, through ownership of assets, are able to make others pay for the privilege of being able to exist and work, and these owners are basically left idle at the hands of others. So I guess let's just pause to consider as well this idea that what is considered right or wrong, virtuous or immoral, or even just normal or not normal, these are all cultural creations, right? So these are things that we as a society have either intentionally through propaganda, education, etc., have said are right or wrong, or things that just kind of happen on their own. But in both cases, they are like basically created by us. They're not like truths with a capital T, right? If I say like going out and just like hitting someone in the face is wrong, granted, I do think it's probably generally wrong, but that's viewed as wrong in our society. Whereas I don't know, the ancient Mayans or Aztecs or one of the two used to play this game, and it was like a football style game in the winter. At the end, as a celebration, would get to be beheaded by the opponent. Now, obviously, in our society, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the idea here is that virtue, right and wrong, etc., what is kind of glorified or worshipped, even in some cases, is a cultural artifact or cultural creation. And so Russell points out that the making of work into a virtue has largely been directed by this class of like owners and ruling people to basically encourage the people doing the actual work to work more for less. And he points this out that this started in like ancient civilizations. What would happen is you'd have these subsistence farmers making enough money basically just to survive. And then they'd produce a little surplus. And that surplus would be taken forcefully by the warriors and the priests and the ruling class. And what started to evolve is that instead of using force, we started to use ideology or duty or this morality. And you see this in the language often that comes in like propaganda, in the sense of like our messaging and our education and our advertising, which is like, honest work from salt of the earth people to make an honest living. And you can start to see this as Russell points out that he says like at his time, 99% of like workers in the British Empire, if you said that the King of England should not have a larger income than a normal working man, they would kind of just be like shocked, right? Because the conception of duty has been a means used by holders of powers to induce others to live for the interests of those in power rather than for their own. That's a pretty provocative take, right? I'm not saying I agree with all of this, but I think it's worth exploring. And then we start to get into this. Okay, so that's kind of the first idea, is we say that the sort of glorification of hard work and toil and labor in some sense is a form of manipulation, because it's like encouraging people to work more to support the interest of others. I also think it was interesting to look at how kind of irrational it is that we kind of divide up work and leisure the way that we do. So he says, I'll read through this thought experiment. Suppose that at a given moment, a certain number of people are engaged in the manufacture of pins. They make as many pins as the world needs, working, say, 8 hours a day. Someone makes an invention, so technology increase, which we'll talk about later, by which the same number of men can make twice as many pins as before. But the world doesn't need twice as many pins. Pins are already so cheap that hardly anyone will buy more. So in a sensible world, right, everybody concerned in the manufacture of pins would take to working 4 hours a day instead of 8, and everything else would just go on as before. But in the actual world, this would be thought of as immoral or demoralizing. So the men still work 8 hours and there are too many pins. So some of the companies and employers go bankrupt, and then half the men who were previously making pins are thrown out of work into unemployment. So there is, in the end, just as much leisure in the first plan, but you have half the men totally idle and unemployed and unable to meet their needs, and the other half still overworked. So in this way, he writes, it is ensured that the unavoidable leisure shall cause misery all around, right? Because you have people still overworking and then the other half not working at all, instead of being a universal source of happiness. And he says, can anything more insane be imagined? So this was kind of like an aha insight for me, that I think you can actually draw this out to our current society quite clearly. In fact, in 1930, an economist named, what was his name? Oh, John Maynard Keynes wrote a paper titled Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Now, he is one of the leading economists at the time, famous economist still to this day, where he pointed out that if you actually look at the productivity per person and how that will be affected by innovations in technology, like basically he said in like 30 or 40 years, we will all be able to work the same amount we're working now or much less and have far greater levels of output. And now if you go back and look at his predictions versus what actually happened, it's a little crazy. He thought we'd be whatever, like 100 times more effective per person now using technology, right? An example of this is if I am cutting down trees with a hand saw, I maybe can cut down 3 trees a day. If you give me a chainsaw, I can cut down 20 trees a day. If you give me whatever the hell they use now, like some big excavator looking thing with a massive blade on it, I can cut down 100 trees a day. So you get these exponential increases in the output from my same amount of time or my same amount of labor. So when you look at what actually happened after he wrote that essay, his predictions were far, far less than what actually happened. We are thousands and orders of magnitude, tens, thousands, millions, whatever, essentially exponentially more productive per unit of time. But instead of transferring this into a more equitable distribution of leisure time, so for instance, everyone now works 6-hour days instead of 8-hour days, we've actually used it to, in many cases, work more and more intensely than ever before, and the kind of benefits or surplus created by those technological advancements are unevenly distributed to a very, very small percentage of people who own the assets. So does that make sense? Right? So far, what we're saying here is that with modern technology, it would be fairly easy for us to, in the pins example, do option 1, where we all have greater means of production. We can all just work a little less and have the same or still better standard of living. But instead, we basically elect to have people go unemployed and people overwork in this big, intense competition with a very, very small percentage of people siphoning off that excess surplus. So I think what I'll leave you with, and I'm drawing still on Russell's essay, is he offers a pretty incredible vision for how this could be and how I believe this relates back to happiness. So listen to this. He says, in a world where no one is compelled to work more than 4 hours a day, every person possessed with a scientific curiosity would be able to indulge it, and every painter would be able to paint without starving. Men who in their professional work have become interested in some phase of economics or government will be able to develop their ideas. Medical men, so doctors, will have time to learn about the progress of medicine instead of just seeing patients all day. Teachers will not be struggling to teach by routine things that they learned in their youth, which may be now untrue. They'll have time to actually plan out their lessons. And above all, there will be happiness and joy of life instead of frayed nerves, weariness, and dyspepsia. The work exacted will be enough to make leisure still delightful, but not enough to produce exhaustion. And for the record, dyspepsia, I think, is kind of like neurosis, like stomach ulcers and stuff that come from being way stressed out. And now I'm going to take a little segue here beyond the essay, because there is actually some pretty interesting research that indicates this is true, particularly the Good Samaritan study, which is actually a series of studies they looked at where it turns out that people, when they are in a hurry, when they're really rushed, then they don't feel like they have enough time for something, they are actually far less likely to behave altruistically or behave like in a pro-social way where they're concerned about others. So what he's starting to suggest here is it's like, people would have time to be more creative, more innovative, but also have a pace where they can actually slow down and volunteer themselves to be like better citizens, to be better neighbors, and ultimately to invest in the things that we already know will bring more happiness, right? I think that, and I could go on referencing a ton of different research here, which I won't do for the sake of this video, but we know that quality sleep, sufficient sleep of 8 to 9 hours per night consistently is one of the leading indicators of health and happiness. A lack of sleep is related to things like Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, stroke. Pretty much all of the main health issues in developed society are relate to lack of sleep. We'd have time to get a little bit more exercise. We'd have time to have fun. We'd have time to engage in the community, whether it's religious communities or more like politics and the civil community. And we would have time to actually invest more in our relationships, which we know are a pillar of happiness and well-being. So, as I said at the beginning of this video, I'm starting to believe that this shift in viewing hard work and hours worked not actually as a positive thing, but almost as an external factor or an externality. That's the term from economics, right? A sort of a public health and happiness negative, right? That it's something that we should, again, not say we should never work and all be lazy and stuff, that'll never work, but to say that in economy or a society where all individuals from all classes are generally working less would be a lever or a pathway to improve the flourishing of the entire culture and the entire society, right? Where people are going to have more time to engage meaningfully in their work, but also to have leisure time for relationships, for personal health, all of these different things, as well as learning and innovation. To summarize, then, I think I'll leave you with Russell's final lines of his work. Good nature is, of all moral qualities, the one that the world needs most. And good nature is a result of ease and security, not a life of arduous struggle. Now remember, that relates to the research that I said that is actually shown that when you are have time, you have time to care more about others and your own personal health. Anyway, modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all, but we have chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for others. Hitherto, we have continued to be as energetic as we were before there were machines. In this, we have been foolish, but there is no reason to go on being foolish forever. So there you have it. I think that reduced work time in general and changing our sort of ethical and virtuous view of work is saying that work is not inherently good or bad. It's just work, and there's nothing virtuous about doing more of it for work's sake. Would be an important lesson in improving happiness, both for one and for all. So if you enjoyed this video, here's another one that YouTube suggests you'll like. As always, on my channel, you will find both resources and insights from kind of the science of happiness, as well as the art of happiness, which this video is more in line with the art and philosophy. But in both cases, I hope that you'll find some of it both interesting and practical. And that's all for now. This has been your happiness nerd, Jackson Kirchis. I'll see you next time.